Welcome to episode 6 of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. It's April 30th, 2020. We are bringing you a movement for an actual revolution. We're bringing you a show that provokes and challenges the way you're thinking about the world. And we are trying to bust open the biggest framework. Tina, there is no alternative, but there is. And it exists in the work and the leadership of Bob Avakian. And at the top of the website, revcom.us, you can find this statement every week. Bob Avakian is completely different than the endless stream of bourgeois politicians who are put forward as leaders, whose goal is to maintain one variation or another of this system of capitalism imperialism that is founded on and perpetuates itself through cruel and literally life-stealing exploitation, murderous oppression, and massive destruction in all parts of the world. BA is a revolutionary who bases himself on the scientific understanding that this system must finally be overthrown through an organized struggle involving millions of people and replaced with a system that is oriented to and capable of meeting the most fundamental needs of humanity and enabling humanity to become fit caretakers of the earth. Bob Avakian is the architect of a whole new framework of human emancipation, the new synthesis of communism, which is popularly referred to as the new communism. All of this is why we recognize that Bob Avakian, BA, is the most important political thinker and leader in the world today. And here at the RNL show, we strive to apply that scientific method and approach, and we bring you his work. So I'm here with Sunsara Taylor, who's my co-host, and I was very concerned that well, let's just say this. The events of the past week have echoed the themes as well as the topics that we've been discussing on this show, from science to the fascism to the nature of the system to what to do about it. But I thought we'd just recap a couple of things. And, I was concerned that you weren't taking any baths in Clorox or drinking Clorox or thinking somehow you could get the sunlight inside of you. So this speaks to the importance of science. Maybe you can talk
Andy,
a little.
You don't know I have light inside me all the time.
Ah, yes, that's right. You people don't know what you're missing. It's just a glow here. You think there's studio lights. It's just Sunsara. But go ahead. Tell us about this.
No, we had a week of fascist insanity. Absolute anti-science, and it's the temptation to just ridicule. Look, it's obviously ridiculous. It should be ridiculed, but the temptation to just ridicule what's going on from the podium, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military empire and system that has existed in human history, thumping threats to reporters, inciting fascist mobs, and telling people to drink bleach, Lysol, and maybe import sunbeams into them to eradicate a pandemic, a global disease that is ravaging the planet and destroying lives. It is, if you wrote it as even an absurd comedy, no one would buy it. It is beyond, and it needs to be taken very seriously, and people need to respond to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy.
Well, and the lack of scientific approach here, in that, I mean, it's almost absurd to say the lack of scientific approach. There is certifiable.
It's anti-science, yeah.
It's anti-science. There's certifiable lunacy within it. Various scientists and doctors have written things, and people have signed petitions about that. But there is a fascist agenda behind it, and we should understand that the anti-science aspect of those comments about the bleach are actually there's actually organized forces, conspiracy forces that are actually out marketing bleach and have been for some time as a cure for autism. That's created unbelievable problems. But an even bigger problem here is the Christian fascism that's at the core of the regime, that itself believes in things that don't exist and are trying to establish a theocracy in this country. Yet on the other side of the divide are Democrats who themselves have their own illusions and delusions about what we're actually facing. And this is something that also characterized this week. You just mentioned the State House fascist rallies that Trump has fomented from the bully pulpit of these COVID briefings that he was doing. But look, we talked earlier in this show, a previous episode, that Representative Steve King, who himself is a fascist lunatic, has said, our side has 8 trillion bullets, while the other side is debating what bathroom to go to, which from our point of view, there's a tremendously just struggle over transgender rights. But there is a point he's making that we're serious about civil war.
They're serious.
They're serious. We being the fascists.
Yeah,
he's saying, look, we're serious about this. They're not. And there's a point there that we got into last week in a clip from Bob Avakian. And let me just read one paragraph. Let me just read this one paragraph, and then I want to get into this Bernie and Biden thing. This is from the Refuse Fascism Call to Act, which we call Silent No More. It says, "Let us not hope against facts that the 2020 election, the same election that Trump was on trial for sabotaging, is enough to resolve this crisis. What will we do if Trump wins or loses and refuses to step down? What damage will the fascist forces he has unleashed continue to inflict, even if he does lose and leaves vengeful? No election, fair or fraudulent, can legitimate what has been normalized over the last 3 years." And I just want to say one more thing about this Biden, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and what the terms are. And then I'd like you to talk a little bit about this immigration, because that was an absolutely dead serious fascist move of the past week. Both wings of the Democratic Party, or the people who are very active, are in serious denial. On the one hand, and this includes progressive people, there is a tremendous move on now that everybody has to get behind Biden to stop Trump because he's that dangerous. Noam Chomsky said this. And yet, at the same time, in the same breath, in the same talk, he and many others from former SDS leaders like Mark Rudd and others are saying this isn't fascism, it's proto-fascism, it's authoritarianism. Yet they see it as the most dangerous thing, so therefore you have to get right inside the very system that produced this. And on the other side of the equation, in this divide of Bernie supporters, former Bernie supporters, which Noam Chomsky was, and are to say, well, look, no, it's not really. Biden and Bernie are the same. There's no difference. Therefore, we're going to put our work into seeing what reforms we can do and grassroots.
You mean Trump and Biden?
Right. They're saying Trump and Biden are the same, right?
And they're grabbing a hold of and lifting up the real crimes of Biden. War crimes that he was involved in instrumental in the war in Iraq, and mass incarceration, real crimes of Biden and of the Democratic Party, but using this, looking at this to obscure the qualitative leap and fascism of Trump, and to say, we can just tinker around the edges and ignore this fight over fascism. Yeah,
including that Biden was, first off, the war criminals and war crimes of the Democratic Party are extraordinary. And if you just go for this, you're actually giving your validation to that. But that still doesn't mean there's not a difference, and a qualitative difference in the form of rule from this Trump-Pence regime. And let's be also clear that Biden was instrumental in mass incarceration, instrumental in the deportations that took place under Obama. And yes, there is a qualitative difference too with what Trump is doing. But the key thing here in refusing to say it's fascism, and it's not just say it, but to act on it, has to do with the fact that if it's not resisted now, it can become too late. In every struggle, the struggle for revolution as well as the struggle for the reforms that these people want will become much more difficult, including the very real prospect that the election will either not happen or be rigged. Even Biden has said that Trump wants to postpone the election. And this fascism is a product of this system. And I want to commend to people to go on the website revcom.us and read an article that's titled, "For Those Who Cling to the Myth of This Great American Democracy, Some Simple Questions," by Bob Avakian. And he begins by saying, "Can anyone honestly deny the plain truth of the following words boldly spoken by the abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass in a July 4th speech in 1852? For revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival." And both sides of this particular divide need to answer that and read this simple question, and so do all of you in our audience. But before we move on to the show, I would like you to talk about the changes that they pushed in under the radar on immigration that are extraordinarily dangerous, and yet there's no real outcry except for a very small section of the immigrant rights and legal community.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and people do need to know about this. And it's almost not being commented on, and it's hardly being covered, and it's slipping under the radar, like you said. This week there were two major escalations in Trump's xenophobic ethnic cleansing war on immigrants. It's a core battering ram of his fascist program. One was he signed an executive order completely suspending all green cards. They are stopping the issuing of 385,000 green cards of people who had applied and waited for years all over the world to reunite with family, to come for medical reasons, to come for employment reasons, to come for education reasons. This is hugely dramatic. It's a major escalation. There's been a war on undocumented immigrants. It's unjust. This is reaching into the fabric of American society in a way that I think people have not reckoned with. Two, as part of this too, Stephen Miller, who's one of Trump's Nazi top advisors, was caught on a phone call saying straight up to the really anti-immigrant base of Trump, who was mad this didn't go far enough. Stephen Miller was saying, don't worry, this is just the beginning. We'll go further with this. And we should take him at his word. And the other major thing that happened, again under the radar, is Betsy DeVos, who is one of these Christian fascists, who was handpicked by Trump, and probably Pence had a role in it, as the head of education under this regime, has made it so that all COVID-related relief that goes to students will exclude international students, almost 1 million foreign students in this country. Plus it can't go, because of her, to DACA recipients, 400,000 DACA recipients, dreamers, which means essentially, one, all these people, everybody's enduring hardship. Many of them will be driven out of the education system into financial ruin among many of the dreamers, which will have cascading impact on their lives and their communities. But also, I think there's long-term change in the configuration, potentially in higher education in a much more lasting way. Even as this is a one-time policy on a certain level, it could have very lasting implications.
I want to just read the very last lines of the Refuse Fascism call before we move on to our discussion of the leadership that we have. And it says this: "We pledge that we will not stand aside while there is still a chance to stop a regime that imperils humanity and the earth itself. We come from different perspectives, but united in our determination, we say, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. The Trump-Pence regime must go."
I recently was part of co-hosting a fundraising live stream for the Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour, as well as for this show, the Revolution Nothing Less show. And I want to send a thank you to everybody who donated to the tour and to this show. During this, one of the donations we got was from somebody who gave a $50 gift certificate to a local grocery store to help feed the volunteers with the Revolution tour. And we really appreciate the donation and the groceries. They also sent a very thoughtful comment explaining why they were giving and posing some big questions for the revolution. Questions that they have and questions that all of us need to be thinking about and wrangling with. And at the time I read it on air and I said, wow, these are big questions. We're not going to attempt them on the spot, but we will be taking them up over time on the Revolution Nothing Less show, as well as in the pages of revcom.us. So we want to follow through on that commitment and begin to dig into these questions today. So what I want to do is read their letter, and then I'll explain a segment that we're going to show from the film from Bob Avakian that speaks to some of what they pose. So this is how they describe themselves. They start their letter by describing themselves as someone who grew up in a family of activists and activism, a family that witnessed firsthand the beatings and lynchings from the last century, from the only true folks that had a genuine concern about the welfare of these African Americans, who were and are the people you are addressing today, which is a historical fact. So that's how they begin, and that's a little bit of explanation of where they're coming from. And then they continue. Right now is an opportune time to make a case against the profit makers. Capitalism keeps people impoverished. Trump won't hear that, and the bankers are not concerned with the people. I brought in millions today. Screw them. I got mine. I'm donating to the National Revolution Tour because I feel fortunate that I can donate. I have donated because there is a need for leadership, and I gave funds because I want to do something rather than nothing. And right now, people are searching. Hospital workers, activists, many people. Big questions for the National Revolution Tour. What is your concept of leadership? How does Bob Avakian propose to carry this revolution out? Historically, there have not been that many revolutions. So how easy is that? It's not. I know this nation has a cancer, but it isn't just about removing cancer. There has to be rehabilitation. I believe revolution is a natural thing. It also means war. One big question is, how do the 80% of the people benefit from this revolution? Okay, there are millions of idiots with Confederate flags and American flags, but how to benefit the 80%? How to control the center of the board, to use a concept from chess. Who can diagnose what we have and get us through this, through the coronavirus and through this system, which impoverishes billions of people around the world? So this is a number of very big questions. We really appreciate this feedback and these questions. And like I said, we're not going to try to tackle all of them today, but we wanted to carve into the beginning two questions they pose, which is, what is your concept of leadership? And how does Bob Avakian propose to carry this revolution out? And the way we want to begin to speak to this is to share a clip from the speech, why we need an actual revolution and how we can really make revolution, the speech that Bob Avakian gave in 2018. And in this segment that we're going to share, BA begins by reflecting back on the 1960s and uses this to open up what kind of leadership is needed for a revolution and what's the importance of the leadership that Bob Avakian is providing now. And so we want to share this clip, and he ends it with a challenge, something that we should take to heart, and the responsibility of all of us who yearn for a better world and a different fate for humanity. What is our responsibility in relationship to this leadership that we have? So let's show that clip.
This year is the 50th anniversary of 1968. Even the representatives and advocates of this system cannot simply ignore the significance of that year and the very positive upheaval, rebellion, militant defiance, and radicalization that characterized it and that period overall. However, as can be seen, for example, in the CNN series 1968, they are once again trying to force all this into the framework of ruling class interests and ruling class politics, and in particular the presidential election of that year. And there are progressives who insist that the left made a terrible mistake in 1968 by not supporting the Democratic candidate for president, Hubert Humphrey, which they say allowed Richard Nixon to win the election and gave support and impetus to the right wing in its backlash against the progressive movements and gains of the 1960s. What is revealed in this critique is the utter inability or the refusal of such progressives to see and think beyond the confines of capitalist relations and capitalist rule, even in attempting to analyze the kind of situation that existed in 1968 when great numbers of people were precisely challenging and breaking out of those confines. By 1968 and for several years after, there were large numbers of people in this country, including millions of youth from the middle class, as well as masses of poor and oppressed people, who were motivated by a thoroughly justified hatred of this system and aspirations for a radically different and better world. And this reached deeply into the system's own armed forces. Even if the understanding of most was marked by revolutionary sentiment, which, while righteous, was lacking in any deep and consistent scientific basis. And the real failure of that time was that there was not yet a revolutionary vanguard with that scientific foundation and method, and the orientation, strategy, and program that could give organized expression to the mass revolutionary sentiment and lead a real attempt at actually making revolution. That is a challenge before us now. And now, particularly because the work that I have done and the leadership I have been providing over the decades since the 1960s, we do have the further development of the scientific method and approach to revolution with the new communism. We have the strategic approach and plan for making this revolution. We have the Constitution for the new socialist republic in North America, a sweeping vision and concrete blueprint for a radically new and emancipating society aiming for the emancipation of humanity as a whole. But let's be straight up. What we do not have yet are masses of people who are won to revolution and driven to work for it, especially youth who are always the driving force of any revolution. And although we have the foundation and scaffolding of revolutionary organization that could be built on and expanded into a vanguard force capable of actually leading the revolution all the way through, we do not yet have the necessary cadre of leadership on all levels and in all parts of the country who have not only the determination, but also the scientific grounding to lead the masses who must be brought forward in making revolution. While some of us who came forward during the 1960s have retained, indeed deepened, our revolutionary passion and the scientific grounding that sustains it, many others have given up on revolution. And although there are literally tens of millions in this country who hate the injustices and indignities that people suffer under this system, and who can be awakened to the possibility of a radically different and better world, as yet far too few have been brought forward into the ranks of the revolution and developed and trained as revolutionary leaders. This is what all those who cannot stand to live another day under this monstrosity of a system and are filled with passionate intensity to bring this system down and bring a radically different world into being, this is what we all need to be actively working toward. Building up the ranks of the revolution, first in the thousands, and then as things develop toward the decisive point, millions, as an organized force, and learning to become leaders of this revolution who can enable those millions to be in a position to fight all out with a real chance to win when the time comes. This is not a revolution for revenge. The goal is not for exploited and oppressed humanity to have a chance to become exploiters and oppressors themselves. It is a communist revolution whose goal is nothing less than putting an end to all relations of exploitation and oppression, and all the degradation and destruction bound up with this throughout the world.
Okay, so that was Bob Avakian from the speech, Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make Revolution. And we thought it'd be important to share that clip in response to the question we got of what is your concept of leadership and how does Bob Avakian propose to carry forward this revolution? there's more that the questioner raised, and there's more that we need to discuss over time. But we thought this would be a good beginning to carve in, and we will be returning to this in future episodes. I want to take the opportunity to also note that we really appreciate the comments and the feedback and the questions we get. The people who write to us at our email address, therevcoms@gmail.com, or commenting below in the comment section of the YouTube right now. Please take a moment and do that. Let us know what you thought of this clip, what you're thinking of the show overall. And like we did with this letter, and we'll continue to do, we will be sifting through those and responding to more of them in future episodes.
All right, so next we're going to go to an interview I did with Zack Fisher, who is the president of the UCLA Graduate Student Association. And Zach is very involved in leading struggle at UCLA in support of the University of California, Santa Cruz graduate students who went on a wildcat strike that was, in their first outing, was brutally suppressed on the orders of the president of the California college system, former Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano. This is a struggle over the very low pay that graduate students who teach receive, and their the housing costs, and the fact that many of them are living at close to a subsistence level. But I broadened this out to a broader discussion of what's going on the campuses in terms of and how this impacts the struggle over critical thinking, the broader issues of what is the nature of the society, and students as a force for change, and how this strike impacts that. And we won't have all of that up on the website because we wanted to get to a question of the Bernie Sanders campaign, that Bernie ended the campaign, as our viewers know. You know that he also endorsed Joe Biden. And Zach was a supporter of Bernie Sanders since 2015, and in fact, he goes back further. And so we got into that to sort of get some first impressions as to what people who were put a lot of hope and stock in Bernie's campaign. And this was a first exploration of all of that. And you'll watch the interview and you'll see where we go. Good. Okay, so I'm here with Zak Fisher via Skype. Welcome to Revolution Nothing Less, the RNL show, Zach.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you know, the universities have always, and I'm going back to the 60s, have always been centers of the, the military-industrial complex. They've been funded largely by defense research, and there's all of this kind of thing in the actual role of the universities in terms of feeding, particularly the elite universities, feeding people into the system. But that that's not been their only role. They've also been centers of critical thinking, of places where people engage the big questions that are facing humanity. It's a point where a location where there's tremendous wrangling over what kind of world we should be living in, and with the whole STEM culture, there's been an overall erosion of that aspect of the university. But how do you see this struggle in that light, in terms of a time of emerging fascism? And
so, I mean, I think that what you're talking about historically, yes, that has happened, and I mean, I hope that continues to happen. But unfortunately, I think that the sort of fascist paradigm that we're slipping into, or arguably, already have slipped into, the universities are not going to present a significant pushback against that. I mean, I think that maybe there are some people who still go to universities, even at the grad student level, trying to advance the cause of human knowledge and try to liberate peoples. But I think the vast majority of people, including students, end up at these universities because they want the credential that will get them the job that they feel they need to have the income that they need to support their family or whoever. And even if you try to separate, like I say, the academic work from the kind of ethos of the administration and the faculty, it's difficult. I mean, look at we're in the COLA stuff, like we've been kind of shocked. Maybe we shouldn't have been shocked. Maybe we were naive to begin with. But at the beginning, we were hopeful. Oh no, of course faculty will get on board with this because they teach these subjects about labor and liberating people, and they talk a very good game about this kind of stuff. But then you ask them to strike alongside you, or you ask them to vocally go out in front of folks to say, hey, we support you. And there might be a handful here or there, but they are by and large the exception, not the rule. And we have folks now, with the COVID stuff, saying, you shouldn't even be talking about striking at all. Faculty, telling us you shouldn't be talking about striking at all. You're just overprivileged, whiny babies, basically, and look at how lucky you are to have this opportunity to get this education. And this is not coming from conservative, professors. This is coming from folks who teach subjects and might even call themselves Marxists. It's been really shocking that way. How when the pavement hits the road, they don't support free thinking and critical. They support their job and they support the institution, which is strikingly authoritarian, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, speaking of the University of California.
Well, it's, that they do that has a lot to do with a very narrow framework of criticism that exists right now. But that can also be politically and epistemologically and ideologically exploded. And it was true in the 60s. The universities were highly repressive. But there was a way in which at that time, for reasons that we don't have time to get into fully today, but that students went up against that and brought in a different ethos and actually fought for critical thinking and questioning all authority and the very fascistic nature of the university itself, and that there is a struggle now that's actually joined with involving police, former Homeland Security Secretary, the entire state system, and that possibly there's and we should, it seems to me, strive to open up this to the larger issues as well as the issues of the graduate students being able to have a living a wage and housing and child care support and all the issues that have been raised, as well as the racial discrimination that also I understand is part of the demands of the grad students.
Yeah, it can be done. I don't, I think, before, maybe a month ago, I would have said, there's a very good chance now. Unfortunately, I don't know. And I don't know how much of it has to do with the pandemic, but obviously you can't ignore that.
Right. Well, maybe we just, I also, one of the reasons I invited you on is that as you were working on this struggle around the gross inequality on the campus itself, and I know that you're concerned and your fellow strikers are concerned not only about your own position in society, but the inequality more broadly. And as such, you were a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but now we have a situation where he's withdrawn from the campaign. He's endorsed Biden. So I just really wanted to learn how you are thinking and processing and thinking and reflecting on the campaign and that avenue for redress of all these things, and what other friends and people you know of, the trends that exist in that movement.
Yeah, well, I was Bernie Sanders' constituent when I was in college. I went to school in Vermont, and actually I had the chance to meet him a few times, sat next to him on a plane going from Burlington to D.C. And so I knew who he was long before he ran for president, and I thought that he was a voice for good. Look, I'm an American. I'm proud of the Constitution. I think that representative government is good, and I think that I vote because I do believe that it matters. And I think that Bernie Sanders was by far the best, even, remotely viable choice of the last two cycles. I don't agree with him on everything. I think that, there are patterns of his thinking that don't totally always make sense to me. But I went to one of his very first campaign events in Concord, New Hampshire in 2015. In June of 2015, I believe it was the first stop after he announced that he was going to run for president the first time. And, he struck me as a incredibly normal person who really wanted to fight for good. And that got me excited. And I happily and enthusiastically supported him both the first time and this last time. I'm an independent. I have never identified as a Democrat. I've never identified as a Republican. I think that the most toxic element of our political life today and for a long time has been partisanship, that parties exist at all. I think, like I was saying, I really do believe in the Constitution. I believe in this style of government. I believe it can work. But I think that partisanship has poisoned it. And I think that I had great respect, and I still do have great respect for Bernie Sanders being an independent, senator for, I think, maybe longer than anybody else. Certainly the longest serving in there right now. And so I thought, this is a shot to sort of blow up that partisan system. And that's really what I saw in him. And I, in that light, I am disappointed in the way that he has handled the end of this campaign. I mean, yes, from the very beginning, saying, I would support the Democrat, of course. In the end, right, if it's not me, I'll support whoever it is. But he was clearly, the victim of a well-orchestrated attempt to basically root him out of this entire process. The process was not legitimate in the sense that it was being facilitated by an even ostensibly neutral arbitrator, the DNC, right? Like they picked their horse and Biden from the very beginning, the way everything was framed, with all the questions of the debate, where people stood, every detail of it. That's how I saw it as a Sanders supporter anyway. And so to have him concede and bend the knee so quickly to Biden without any serious concessions was extremely disappointing. And I do not plan on voting for Joe Biden. I think that there was maybe a point where, because I recognize the danger of Trump and the fact. I was there with the Refuse Fascism folks in 2016. And I lived in New York City there, and I've been there with them in LA. And I think that's a noble, important fight. And I recognize that Trump is a distinct kind of danger from even someone like Joe Biden. But I can't, and I'm disappointed that Bernie Sanders didn't fight back against the way that this all went down.
Well, I think there is a lot of turmoil in the camp of people who supported Bernie Sanders. And I want to, as I mentioned to you before we went to the Skype interview, that we want to continue this discussion in a real sense today. I'm just wanting to open it up. I do think in terms of the political sphere, Bob Avakian had said years ago that if you, actually I think it was during the regime of George W. Bush, that if you try to make the Democrats what they are not and will never be, you're going to end up becoming more like what they actually are. And so I think this is part of what we've seen, and certainly, it's another discussion, but Sanders' independence has always been, though, in Congress as part of the Democratic, not always, but for most of the time, part of the Democratic caucus. Zach, I want to thank you for being on the RNL show, the Revolution Nothing Less show, and we want to hear from you again, and we'll be in touch and have you back on.
Great.
Thank you so much for this interview.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and power to all you guys.
Okay, great. Take care.
Good. Yep. Bye-bye.
So that was Zak Fisher, president of the UCLA Graduate Student Association. We first spoke about the wildcat strike of California grad students began at UC Santa Cruz. And I raised this question to him, could that struggle contribute to opening up a deeper, more radical discourse on the campuses, including over what is the problem we face and is a better world possible? And then we went on to discuss the Bernie Sanders campaign. Zach has been an ardent supporter of Bernie Sanders since 2016. And I asked him for his first thoughts on the campaign, especially now that Bernie has withdrawn and endorsed Joe Biden, which Zach strongly opposed. And we discussed, and I see this interview as the opening up a conversation, and that it would inform a future segment on an episode of the Revolution Nothing Less show on the Bernie Sanders campaign, on the danger of the Trump-Pence fascist regime and the 2020 election. And the good news is Zach has agreed to be on such a segment. So I'm expecting, and we should hope to have, a very robust dialogue and even debate on reform and revolution as it is posed today. Why the capitalist imperialist system stands as a barrier to many of the aspirations that Bernie supporters have and which causes such tremendous horror in the world today. And as we strive to bring forward in this episode and every episode of the RNL show, that there is a way out of the madness through an actual revolution. And the difference between an actual revolution and the our revolution of the Bernie Sanders campaign. Before closing this out, I want to strongly recommend to our viewers that they go to revcom.us and read an article by Bob Avakian titled David Brooks, the Not-So-Great Pretender, and the Profound Differences Between Trump, Sanders, and Actual Socialism. in which BA goes deeply into the problem and solution. And so I look forward to Zak being back on the show, and I invite all of our viewers to comment below on the YouTube channel here, as well as to write us about your thoughts on this episode, on the upcoming segment on this, and especially on that article by Bob Avakian. So let's move on now to our next segment. If you're watching this on the night that we stream this, which is Thursday, April 30th, tomorrow is May 1st, May Day, which is an international revolutionary holiday. And reflecting on this, I have a few things to say. One, go to the website tomorrow morning and see the message from the Revolutionary Communist Party. And if you're watching after May 1st, go there and see what we had to say. But what I want to do today, in closing today's show, where we've talked about the question of leadership at the beginning of the show and then in a whole segment, an answer to a question, I want to play a clip from the film Revolution, Nothing Less that we showed a section of earlier. And this clip is called, "Which System, Capitalism or Communism, is the Real Nightmare for Humanity?"
So here is some of what this person raised in his feedback. They wrote, people in this society, and probably some people in the room, have all kinds of ideas about communism. Maybe they even say, okay, I'm with you. This world is really fucked up. People suffer in all kinds of ways. There are all these outrages. But people say that communism has just been a horror, a disaster, that maybe it's a good idea on paper, but it has only been a nightmare in practice. And then they went on. To this, I have a few things to say. First, capitalism, imperialism is the real nightmare for humanity, and it's not even a good idea on paper. Second, where does this idea come from that communism is a nightmare? It comes from the politicians who run this capitalist imperialist system, from the people who decide and control what is and is not taught in the schools, from the media mouthpieces of this system and this system's intellectual hitmen. In other words, from the very people who rule over and enforce this capitalist imperialist system and who have told lie after lie after lie to defend this system. These are the people you're going to trust to tell you about communism? And then they went on. All this would be bad enough. But then for the last few decades, even many progressive voices, including those who once knew better, have gotten bamboozled or bullied to the point where they no longer know and speak the truth about communism. And this creates a situation where everybody knows that communism is a nightmare, when in reality, very few people know anything about what communism actually is and what the actual experience of the communist revolution has been. So they go on, let's talk about that. And here, they say, are a few examples I thought of. The contrast between the 10 million children who die every year under this system from starvation and preventable disease, and the fact that in socialist China, they had solved the food problem so that everyone had enough to eat within 20 years. So remind me, which system is the nightmare for humanity? Or how about the contrast between the situation for women under this system, the millions who are raped and beaten every year, the extreme degradation and enslavement concentrated in pornography and sex trafficking, up against the unprecedented emancipatory advances for women during the first wave of communist revolution in Russia and China. Remind me again, which system is a nightmare for humanity? Or let's contrast the dominant art and culture of this society, real housewives of this or that, and the all too putrid culture that comes through in way too much of hip-hop and so-called stand-up comedy today, up against the revolutionary art and culture that was brought forward through the Cultural Revolution in China, and the prominent role of women and overcoming women's oppression in that art and culture. Remind me once more, which system is the nightmare for humanity? Or contrast the staggering mass incarceration, especially of oppressed nationalities in this country, up against the steps that were taken in Russia to overcome the oppression of minority nationalities. One more time, remind me which system is the nightmare for humanity?
So that was which system, capitalism or communism, is the real nightmare for humanity, from the film B.A. Speaks, Revolution, Nothing Less. So sit with that, think about it, and just to conclude this introduction to the revolutionary holiday, May Day, and thinking about what you're going to do in terms of the world that we live in, the problem we face with this system, and the solution, I want to read from Bob Avakian's memoir, From Ike to Mao and Beyond, My Journey from Mainstream America to Revolutionary Communist, a memoir by Bob Avakian. It was written in 2005. There's a quote from it, that memoir, in Basics. It's Basics 523. And when we asked some prisoners, what's your favorite quote in Basics, this is the one that they overwhelmingly selected. So let me read from Basics 523. If you have had a chance to see the world as it really is, there are profoundly different roads you can take with your life. You can just get into the dog-eat-dog and most likely get swallowed up by that while trying to get ahead in it. You can put your snout in a trough and try to scarf up as much as you can while scrambling desperately to get more than others. Or you can try to do something that would change the whole direction of society and the world the way it is. When you put those things alongside each other, which one has any meaning? Which one really contributes to anything worthwhile? Your life is going to be about something, or it's going to be about nothing. And there is nothing greater your life can be about than contributing whatever you can to the revolutionary transformation of society and the world, to put an end to all systems and relations of oppression and exploitation and all the unnecessary suffering and destruction that goes along with them. I have learned that more and more deeply through all the twists and turns and even the great setbacks, as well as the great achievements of the communist revolution so far, in what are really still its early stages historically. So with that, on May 1st, 2020, beginning of a new decade, I leave you with that, and it's for you to decide, what are you going to do? So thank you for watching episode 6 of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. We'll see you next week.